Dynamic pricing is going to piss off customers. That is a direct quote from Mark Kuperman, the COO at Revenue Management Solutions. In a recent interview with Bloomberg Intelligence, Kuperman doesn't think existing brands are going to be able to achieve success with dynamic pricing. Admittedly, Kuperman has strong opinions on the subject and says, quote, "In no way is it inevitable for restaurants." We'll dig into these strong opinions and more, but first, let's grow. Welcome to the Restaurant Growth Show podcast, where we talk about how operators can use technology to grow their business. We've got a lot to talk about in this episode, but first, let's introduce our co-host. With more than 25 years of online marketing experience, Jose Albus has successfully founded and operated companies in software and hospitality. Lastly, who am I? My name is Gordon. I am your host. I have over 16 years in the food service industry with more than a decade in technology startups. This podcast is sponsored by Dynpricing, real-time restaurant profitability. Dynpricing uses artificial intelligence to improve profitability for restaurants by dynamically updating menus across digital channels. So, Jose, this was a rather spicy end to an interview. The majority of this interview that was done with Michael Halen. He is the senior restaurant and food service analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. They covered stuff like national promotions, labor dynamics, and a whole slew of other topics. But at the end of this interview, it sounded like Kuperman was kind of waiting to take some shots at dynamic pricing and share his opinion. What was your overall opinion of the interview?
I thought it was extremely powerful. What an insightful and knowledgeable person. Like it was rich, entertaining, and I think it's definitely something that every restaurateur should listen to.
Yeah, I agree. And to our listeners, I will definitely share a link to the interview in the podcast description here. I really, really like Mark Kuperman. Everything that he was talking about was based in logic. At the end of this interview, though, a lot of it was opinion, and we'll go through some of these suggestions. We're going to focus today specifically on dynamic pricing. This is a hot topic throughout, but yeah, again, I just feel like there were some opinions there, not necessarily based in fact, and it was kind of his thoughts on the model itself. So let me share a couple of quotes with you all, and I'll ask you for your opinion and ask you a few questions. So the first quote here was from Kuperman is, "Dynamic pricing is driven by the idea that hoping that you can retrain the customer in an existing restaurant is a stretch." Now, he references the customer pushback from building tipping into the bill example in New York recently. If people were unaware, New York is playing around with getting rid of tipping altogether and just folding it directly into the bill. And there's been some pretty significant pushback from customers. So considering that pushback, Jose, in New York regarding tipping, do you see a similar resistance with dynamic pricing across the industry?
I think it all depends on how you implement. We've touched on this before with the example of the pub chain in the UK, and I think that there is ways of doing this. I think that example of New York where you include the tip, I can see how that constraint, you're limiting the decision power of the customer where they cannot decide anymore if the service that they received. So I think that is a very unfair way of doing this, and I can easily see that, of course, there would be a pushback. You're forcing them to compensate without having a say in the matter or how the service was for them.
Right. And so do you think when customers are experiencing dynamic pricing as it gradually gets rolled out internationally, really, and industry wide, do you think that dynamic pricing is going to have that sort of harsh response?
Again, it depends on how it's done. I think that there is another part of what he mentioned in the interview where he mentions the example of a chain that decides that in 2024, we're not going to change our price. We're not going to increase it. And then later to learn 9 months later that they didn't do any changes and they're hurting in multiple ways. And the experience, there was no change. The inflation month by month started eating at the margins. He mentions the gap between the prices on groceries versus versus restaurant and food pricing, if you think about it, it's just widening for a restaurant, especially if it doesn't do any adjustments. So I think that without jumping into a solution, it is important that restaurants actually take a look at their menu and optimize in a pace and a cadence, like he says, that makes sense for both the client, their promotion and messaging, the marketing campaigns, and what the consumers' reactions are going to be, because it is important for restaurants to adjust so that they can continue to be in business. There's so many other variables that come into play that it is important that they actually pay attention to what they're doing and gain that expertise. Their websites had a full of resources, and I think that it is an opportunity to actually pay attention to what they are saying.
To your point, Kuperman talks about this is the right time for promotion and aligning that with your pricing and your marketing campaigns and really customizing campaigns to the individual customer. And we do talk about that quite a bit on this show, and it really helps to be affirmed that now is the time to customize those offers and align that with your overall brand strategy. As well, you mentioned the gap between grocery inflation and the typical QSR.
Yeah.
That gap is significant, and there has never been a better time, in my opinion, for restaurants to really hone in on that customization and really treat their customer like the individual consumer that they are. Each one of us is very unique. So let me pick up another quote here from this interview. Kuperman says that he would change the delivery price. Why? Because the customer has been trained that surge is associated with movement. So charging more during busy hours seems controversial, and I think that's the biggest pushback with the dynamic pricing model. Can restaurants leverage this without compromising customer loyalty and experience, in your opinion?
I think so. I think that there is a way of, there's a little bit of perception there, and it's related to the usual Uber surge that everybody experiences, and kind of like have learned to change the behavior to wait a little bit. It's not that bad if I get there 15 minutes later, as long as I get a better price, right? Similar, like it's very different what you would have to do here, because I think that when he touches on the 9-month gap of making an adjustment to and without going into the detail of the optimization of menus that he talks about, but that gap in a world like today where there's like so many variables and inflation, which, cost of goods, it's not going to go down. So right. The restaurant has to adapt to that, and keeping in mind that for a chain, that franchisee that it's in a different province or state will have a different impact when you do a national approach to giving even a promotion, right? $5. $5 promotion has a different impact to people in, like he says, California or Alabama. Now, I see an opportunity for some of these chains that are large, that have a huge presence, trans-state and province, but don't have the big budget to do national campaigns on TV, for example, that makes it a big commitment, because they are able to be more granular when it comes to adapting to those local needs and responses. Now, imagine that this restaurant that didn't update anything, okay, it was just a policy with not changing price, right? That they actually, instead of that, did gradual updates to the price every month, every second month, and that would give them also the opportunity to give discounts more regularly, or different types of discounts. Then we're talking about a more stable, people will get used to that price, because we always do, and they're just going to see that there's more offers. That is one of the variables that plays into giving value for an exchange of a price update that he also talks about. There's also obviously the investment in new packaging, the dining experience, remodeling, all that kind of thing. So it's keeping in mind that there's ways of adding value to justify some of these things, and at the same time play with the personalization, like you said, at the regionalization as well of the different prices and different offers. So there is a way, he also says, and I loved when he was saying, there is so many variables now that it is important to consider all of those. Now, sometimes a restaurateur, even the executives don't have time to be measuring some of these things. And I think that that's where a really powerful optimization, and remember that he also says, with the blanket approach, if they go, okay, we're going to do this quarter 5% increase on everything. If you see the basket of a particular customer could rise up by 20% at the end. So you got to keep that into consideration, and you got to make it with a cadence that makes sense so that the impact in the general public, but your special customers have a good experience with the changes.
Yeah, I've found that some of his statements were contradictory, because when he was talking about all of the different variables, and he talked about consider the variables over and over and over again, are you trying to tell me that a model like dynamic pricing that can consider those variables in real time, you're trying to tell me that that is bad for a restaurant? Now, again, I think he's looking at it maybe in a bit of a vacuum, in that demand goes up, it's rush hour, and all of a sudden our restaurant is charging customers more for that. And that's all he's looking at. I didn't hear him mention once digital throughout this entire interview. And everything that he was saying seemed factual, logical, thought out, but digital never truly entered the conversation. And it was sort of a blanket approach to changing markets with inflation that may be tapering off, maybe, but we, like you said, we don't really see cost of goods going down. He said that himself. Cost of goods likely aren't going to go down. So restaurants should still consider raising prices in 2024, when the general consensus is that restaurants are probably going to stand pat on prices and maybe even lower them. So there are a couple of contradictory statements that I didn't necessarily agree with, and I don't think that he's completely looking at dynamic pricing from a digital standpoint, when we know that restaurants are driving 30, 40, sometimes 50% of their revenue is coming from these channels.
I mean, I don't blame him. It is what happens in this industry. It's secondary, forgotten, except when they learn or have learned that the commission in third party, for example, are so big that they do a blanket approach of increasing their prices in those channels. And again, if you're going to do a 20% increase, well, guess what? Move it to offer some discounts as well. You're already putting it up there, and the consumer is going app to app to see the comparison of the items that they want, right? So you got to study the basket, like he says, the whole ticket, to see how it's structured, and from that data, optimize. So at that point, you see that there is an opportunity to actually technology help in that, to do an optimization for whatever reason, at inflation time of year, day with weather, and then actually make an optimization in a way that, okay, people that love their shawarma will pick it from third party number one because it's cheaper, but guess what? It may be at the end the same value for basket. So I think that what he was saying in terms of, and I mean, he has a very good point, in the sense that if it's going to be somewhere, it should be in the delivery, because the drivers and the surge of Uber and all of that, it's already something that has happened. So it's basically no change in terms of dynamic pricing.
Yeah, that behavior has already been affected years ago.
So now the other part that was really interesting to me, that you and I have talked about so much, is talk to your customer, communicate, like in terms of like promotions and marketing at the right moment, with the right promotion, and then what you're bringing is you're giving a rounded experience. Now they have more choices. So again, so informative, so rich, excellent interview. I cannot say enough.
So Kuperman goes on to say, there's only one model in my mind, and that is full price and discounting. And so that sort of touches on the point that you were making earlier. He says that if I had to do dynamic pricing right, I would really look at, let's say, delivery charges. And I did mention that before, but this is in line with what we were talking about. And that's promotional pricing, utilizing the dynamic pricing model. And I think the real big pushback again is the in-house in-house dining. Changing prices while diners are eating, I think is wrong. So
Yeah.
that I do agree with Kuperman on, is that sitting down in a physical establishment and seeing someone else pay a different price, whether it's more or less, that is off-putting to say the least. But on these digital channels where people are looking to dine at home or go through a drive-through or have delivery, I think dynamic pricing makes perfect sense. And that's where we differ, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's obvious if you're in a restaurant, and the example of the pub is even worse because at least in the restaurant, you're, half an hour, maybe 40 minutes if you have a longer conversation. But when you're in a pub and you're on your third beer and it's $1, €1 higher than the previous two, that is a terrible experience to have. So I don't think it's the case here. I think that just like, as you know, online marketing and the user behavior that enters a funnel can have is an opportunity to give them a very specific experience. So with multiple channels, you can, even if they're making choices, it could be that they can give a powerful experience to their customers and not compromise their margins, but actually optimizing their menu right there, right then, based on all these variables.
Yeah, I agree. The Stonegate Pubs example, I think it's a dangerous recipe, right? With mixing alcohol with increased prices with a general public that is frustrated over inflation already and everything else that's going on in the world. After my third pint, I don't know that I'm going to be terribly reasonable. Not to say, right?
Don't drink and price.
Exactly. Public service announcement: don't drink and price. Everyone, it's not a good idea. Shout out to the hooligans out there. Please be peaceful. All right, that is all the time we have for this episode. It was really great to have Jose, as always. This was a really spicy take on dynamic pricing. Again, I think there is so much more complexity to this model for restaurants. Regardless of what Mark Kuperman has to say, I believe it is inevitable for this industry in the digital space. However, in store, I don't think it's going to work personally. Until next week, say goodbye, Jose.
Goodbye, Jose.
Thanks, everyone.